Welcome back to this tutorial series. In this tutorial, we're going to add user authentication to our application, our SAP Cloud Application Programming Model application that's set up to run on SAP HANA Cloud. So in this tutorial, we're going to learn how to define security and enable user authentication and authorization for our SAP HANA Cloud CAP application. More specifically, we're going to learn how to create an instance of the user authentication and authorization service, how to incorporate security into the routing endpoint of our application in the application router, and how to configure the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model service so that authentication is required and processed at that level as well. Now, the major prerequisite for completing this tutorial is, of course, to have completed the previous tutorial in this series, where we created database artifacts, we loaded data into them, and then we generated a basic Fiori UI. All that should be running and tested from the previous tutorial. So now we're ready to start creating our XSUAA configuration. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to what the project wizard had initially generated, which was real production level security. We want to both require users to have logged on in order to access our application, but also we want to be able to do authorization checks within our application and maybe not expose all the entities or all the data within an entity to certain users, depending upon the security that they have. Now, so far, we've used the Cloud Application Programming Model to mock our security for our testing up to this point. And that's great, but we want to be able to fully test our security in the development environment, again, without having to deploy it anywhere. We're going to use the same hybrid approach that we did to connect to our HANA database to retrieve real data, but use that to also connect to our security definition on BTP and use our real security configuration and credentials while we test our application in the SAP Business Application Studio. Now, the UAA, User Authentication and Authorization Service, that's part of SAP BTP, is going to provide our user identity as well as all the assigned roles and user attributes that are tied to our user. Now, this is done in the form of a JUT token, JWT, JSON Web Token. And that will be in the authorization header of every incoming HTTP request that's been authenticated. We need the application router in this case to both do the redirect to the UAA for logon processing, but then it will also process this JUT token and forward it to every request that it sends on to the CAP service. And CAP can then use that JUT token to do additional security checks at the application or service level. So what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to manipulate our project at different levels to change both the CAP service definition through the package JSON and the application router as well. Now, in the previous tutorial, we used the application router in our project already. And when we first added it, the wizard created this XS security JSON file as well. We haven't looked at this yet, but it's right here in the root of our project. Now, this file is used during the creation or an update of the XSUAA service itself. And it controls all the roles and the scopes and attributes, role templates, all this that will be part of the security configuration for our application. Now, when it was generated, we really just have a very basic placeholder here of the XS security JSON. It doesn't have anything in it. It's just got the place to add scopes, attributes, and role templates. And what we want to do is so at its current configuration, we can go ahead and use this. It will just require authentication, but not any specific role to be assigned to our user. Now, what we want to do, though, is we want to start defining roles. And we can do this inside the CAP application itself using CDS and let it generate into this XS security JSON. So let's put that aside for just a second. Let's go back to the interaction srv.cds, where we defined our service in the srv folder. And we're going to adjust this. We're just going to add one thing here to the header to say that in order to access the header entity, you need to be at least an authenticated user. And then we're also going to add some security to our items to say in order to access the items entity, you need to be an admin. So this would just be authenticated. This is going to require a user who's both authenticated and has a particular role assigned to them. And then we're going to go even further. We're going to restrict read access to only return records where the language is DE or German. And this is going to show you instance-based authentication, not just entity-based restrictions, but restrictions at the record level as well. Now, that's going to add it to our definition using CDS, but we want to put that configuration into the security JSON. We don't have to manually do that. The Cloud Application Programming Model will do it for us. We can just come here to the command line and say CDS compile and tell it to compile the service directory, so it picks up those changes we just did. And we can say to XSUAA and put those changes directly into the XS security JSON file. All right, and it just modified that file for us. And now if we go look at that file, we see that it has a scope, the admin scope, and that we have a role template that's been added for admin that contains that scope. So if we add that role to our user, we'll get that scope that's defined. Very nice that we didn't have to maintain all this ourselves. But before we can do the testing of our security setup from the Business Application Studio, we're also going to have to add some additional configuration to this XS security JSON. So we're going to need to add another property that will configure the redirect URLs that are allowed for the OAuth configuration. So it's an additional security mechanism that this redirect that we're going to do to the identity provider of BTP is only allowed from certain starting points, and that's what we're going to add in here. We're going to come here towards the end of our configuration, and actually right here, we're going to add special OAuth configuration to say the types that we're going to allow, binding secret and X509, but we're going to allow redirects from the Application Studio. So this way, when we test from the Business Application Studio, it will allow us to redirect to the identity provider and back to our application. Otherwise, we would get a redirect not allowed. So your file should look like this at this point. We also want to add right up here at the top before the scopes, we need to add an XS app name for our security setup and a tenant mode. So we'll just keep that the way it is. And notice that we wildcarded the end of this redirect URL, and that's going to basically allow this to work for whatever application that we're running here from the Business Application Studio. So now that we have our XS security JSON defined, we're able to create the XSUAA instance on BTP, and we can do this using the Cloud Foundry command line. So the command that we're going to do CF Cloud Foundry. We're going to say create a new service. It's going to be of type XSUAA, and application is going to be the plan, and then give it a name. We're just going to name this My HANA App Auth, and then the configuration file, we're going to tell it get its configuration from this XS security JSON. And when we run that, we should see it just like we created our HDI container instance at the Cloud Foundry when we did our binding. This is doing something very similar. It's just creating another service instance for the security of our application at the Cloud Foundry level as well. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to go back to our package JSON. If you remember in the previous tutorial, we changed this to mocked. We actually want to change it right back to XSUAA now, so that the CAP project will be configured to process XSUAA authentication. Now, we want to come back here to the terminal, and we're going to want to do the same sort of binding, the CDS bind that we did before, so that when we run our CAP service, it will run in hybrid testing mode and connect both to the HANA database and this UAA instance. So first, we just need to create a service key for our service that we created in the previous step. This will allow us to access that service from the Cloud Application Programming Model. So I'm just going to say CF, Cloud Foundry, create service key, give it the same name of the service, auth, my HANA app auth, and then let's just call the service key default. Keep it simple. What did I do? Service instance not found, so I probably have a typo. My HANA, oh, the A in app should have been capitalized, so it is case sensitive. There we are. It's working this time because it's taking a couple seconds longer. And it's returned OK. Now, I'm just going to clear this. Now we're ready to bind this to our CAP application so we can do our hybrid testing with CDS watch. So I'm just going to say CDS bind again to, this time instead of HANA, I'm going to give it the instance of our authorization, my HANA app auth, and then the service key default. It's resolving, and it wrote it. What did that do? Auth. Oh, I've got a little problem there. Sorry. I got to put a colon in there. The service key, there we are. That's right. And it wrote the configuration into the same CDS private JSON. Now it has, when it runs hybrid testing, it's got the database configuration, it's got the auth configuration, but in both cases, it's not storing any credentials. It will look up both those set of credentials at runtime when we run our application. Now, before we can run our application, we need to set up the security on BTP and grant it to ourselves. Otherwise, if we test right now, we'd get a not authorized, exactly what we should get, right? So to do that, we want to return here to the BTP cockpit, and I want to go to I want to go to security, and then I want to go to role collections, and normally I just hit create and create a new role collection. I actually already have this from a previous run through. Yep, there it is. My HANA app is already existing. But the only difference there is I didn't have to hit create. It exists already for me. Let me go into edit mode, and you'll see the exact same thing that you would if you were creating it from scratch. I want to add a role to my configuration here, and what do we can look for our application, my HANA app. You'll see it here in the application identifier, and there's our admin role that we defined in the CDS syntax of our service, and then BTP knows about it because it got generated into XS Security JSON that helped define the XSUAA service instance. So we'll just select that role, and we will add it to our role collection. And the only other thing that you want to do while you're in here is you want to go ahead and probably grant this to your own user, again, for testing. There are other ways to grant it to your user, but easy enough while you're in here editing. This one's already granted to my user, so just grant it to your email address that you're using to log into BTP. And then you can go ahead and click Save. Now, the only thing with this is if you've already logged in to through the application router and redirected and pulled in your authentication, it is cached in the browser. And if you add additional roles or attributes to your role collection, you might have to close all your browser windows for it to do a full re-authentication and pull that up, pull in your changes. Now, that shouldn't be a problem in the case of this tutorial because we haven't ran with the application router with authentication turned on yet. So the first time we run it here, it should pick up all of our new definitions. Now, the last thing that we want to do before we fully test our application is we want to adjust the application router as well. Because if you remember in the previous tutorial, it was also set up for real authentication, and we turned it off so we could test without authentication first. So we're going to want to go back to the XSApp JSON file that we used to configure the routing. And if you remember, we turned authentication mode off. We set it to none. So let's just go ahead and turn that back to route for our authentication method. And then I'm going to go ahead, now that we have, we're going to have authentication on our application, we want to have a logout endpoint as well. And we're going to redo our routes here. Let me just go ahead and put these in here. Our two original routes, all we did is add an authentication type of XSUAA to them. But I also added this user API. Now, you notice the target here for user API is actually sending it back to the application router itself. I'll show you this in a minute. It's going to allow us to call a service endpoint of the application router to return information about our user. This is nice from like the client side. If you want to get, say, the email address of the logged in user, you don't have to call out to an external service on BTP to do that. That's already going to be offered as an embedded service inside the application router. So at this point, we've made all the changes necessary to set up security on our application, not just authorization, but also roles and instance-based authorization. We've generated that into an XSUAA instance. We've configured a role and granted that role to our user, and our application router is all set up and ready to handle this as well. So why don't we rerun our application? So I'm at the root. This is going to be the CAP application. So now I'm going to do CDS watch profile hybrid, and we'll see it start up. And one thing you'll see here, well, I'll let it finish starting. There we are. Let me go ahead and open that in another browser tab, but let's come back here. And you see now when it starts up, it resolves both the auth and the DB to those service bindings, and it connects to them. You see it's using the service binding to connect to the HANA database, and it's using authentication type XSUAA. So now when the service, the CAP service itself launches, remember, not behind the application router, but running directly, it now requires authentication, but it's not configured to do any redirect to look up authentication. So what happens when we come in and try to read the header? I get unauthorized, exactly what I should get if I try to access the application router directly. The same thing for the items, I get unauthorized. If I try to come to the web page, now that will pull up the web page itself, but it can't call through to the service. So I get an unauthorized message here as well. Exactly what we want to happen if you come in through the application route, come in without the application router and hit the service directly. But now what do we need to do is we need to run the application router as well in parallel. So let's open another terminal window here. And this time, instead of just doing an npm start, we need to run it through the Cloud Application Programming Model so we can bind to the UAA service as well. And in order to do that, I'm going to use the CDS bind command from the root of the project, but I'm going to tell it now to execute an arbitrary command of npm start, but do that not in the root of the project, but in the, I'm going to tell it prefix app to tell it to run that inside the app folder. And that's going to start the application router, but inject our UAA credentials into the application router as it starts up. It doesn't require us to do any specialized scripting or changes to the application router in order for it to run with real authentication. So we see that it's running on port 5000 now. When I go to it, immediately, instead of loading the page like before, there was a little redirect to the authentication. Now, I get single sign-on here with my authentication, so it's very transparent, but now I'm authenticated to BTP, and if I go to the header record, for instance, instead of getting unauthorized, I'm seeing the data. Now, if I go to the item record, again, I'm seeing the record, but not all the records. Remember what we did here with the items? We said not only do you need the admin role, but we're going to restrict the records that are returned to only show the German ones. So now instead of seeing all the item records, I can only see the one that's marked with language German. So this is instance-based filtering upon security. So only certain records are returned based upon whatever criteria we have there. And I hard-coded German, but that could very easily have been an attribute that's part of my role, and it would have been pulled dynamically out of my user credential, my user identity in BTP, and applied dynamically. And that's how a lot of this instance-based filtering works, so that I only see data for my company or my business area or whatever the criteria may be. So that's a really powerful feature of the cloud application programming model as well. Now let's also come here and let's change the URL, and let's go to User API attributes. That's the special service endpoint of the application router itself. And now I'm getting information: first name, last name, email address, and what scopes are assigned to me. So without having to call back to BTP and the IDP, the identity provider itself, these things are available and cached in the application router. And finally, if we want, we can go ahead and test the UI as well. If I come here and I run the user interface, now instead of getting an unauthorized back, it's able to load the data as well, just as we would expect, but only when we access the application via the application router, so that our security token is fully processed. Now at this point, congratulations, you've successfully configured and tested a production level authentication and authorization for your SAP Cloud Application Programming Model application that is also running directly connected to SAP HANA Cloud. If you want to learn more about packaging and deploying this application or adding HANA native artifacts to it as well, continue on in this tutorial series. We have subsequent tutorials that will show you how to do all of those things.